The Educational Institute of Scotland is the largest teaching union in Scotland and is the oldest teachers' trade union in the world apparently, representing 80% of the country's teachers and lecturers. As of 2014 it had 54,000 members and it's been granted a royal charter by Queen Victoria. It is the only union able to award degrees. Now, I'm not entirely sure how much pull this organisation has when it comes to implementing policies and whatnot, but it has to be said, some of the things that they indulge themselves in are questionable at best, such as their anti-racist education resources. There's a lot of talk just now about the concept of whiteness and everything it encompasses, along with the proverbial generic BS such as white privilege, etc, etc. But the anti-racist experts, activists, whatever you want to call them, they have a footing in the EIS. They have a footing in this institution. They have a footing when it comes to influencing policy. They have an influence on education. Now, between them and Education Scotland and the Scottish Government itself, it becomes rather apparent that there is a huge proportion in the making, if not already, that are rather far left, to say the least. Social justice, human rights based activists, first and foremost, over teacher, educator and so on. So for example, their anti-racist education resources, they've been aware of various new anti-racist education resources, which may be of interest to members. Addressing inclusion, effectively challenging racism in schools, celebrating difference, exploiting stereotypes and anti-racism, the Anti-Racist Educator, etc, etc, as well as challenging anti-Muslim prejudice, turning the tide, Holocaust education, the myths of immigration, showing racism the red card, etc, etc. And it's not just limited to anti-racist education, of course. Oh no. There is a lot more where that came from. Ranging from the LGBT emphasis on the T to feminism, as well as anti-racism and so on. The Anti-Racist Educator is one of the links provided from the trade union, and one does have to wonder just how much influence they have when it comes to policy and in the academia itself. The Anti-Racist Educator is a website which aims to critically challenge racism by exploring teaching, discussing ideas and sharing learning resources for all. The Anti-Racist Educator critically challenges racism in education by sharing knowledge through a blog, glossary, podcasts and various events. A product of the Scottish Association for Minority Ethnic Educators, and the platform is run primarily by a collective of educators of colour working in Scotland. The Anti-Racist Educator is first of all a safe space for people of colour to express themselves without the fear of negative repercussions. But it's more than just a blog. The Anti-Racist Educator is an educational tool for everyone to use, no matter how you racially identify. In Scotland and the United Kingdom and in many other Western nations, race is often forgotten or sidetracked in education by other competing oppressions, such as sexism, poverty. Finding a safe space to discuss, create and share ideas about race is necessary to work towards a socially just world. That's why the Anti-Racist Educator makes its point to isolate race. However, it recognises that collective action is needed for social justice. To avoid counterproductivity, anti-racism cannot be a single issue movement. Therefore, it deals with intersectional oppressions and opposes all forms of hatred and discrimination. Now, certain people that I'm not entirely sure whether or not they're on this website or if they're different people, but they're in the same environment. They host workshops, etc. and they try their damnedest on the regular to ensure that this is incorporated into the academia as a whole. But this is an example of one of their latest posts. Sometimes I just feel too tired. I see my teacher to-do list expanding, inflating and never ending. Alongside my activist wish list of things that would be, could be and should be, I spread myself so thin that even my self-care priorities somehow get pushed aside despite my New Year's resolution. Feeling my colour draining away. Being an educator of colour working in white institutions is psychologically taxing. Being an activist of colour who refuses to give up on the struggle for a better, fairer place, that's a real trial of patience. The guilt that nothing is changing unless we are constantly challenging oppression and dismantling the white supremacist structures that infest our lives. At work, I'm helplessly trying to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. It often seems pointless, but I need to keep chipping away at this gargantuan task. Otherwise, how will my pupils know that better futures are possible? Outside of teaching, I am working with fellow activists to build safer, more compassionate spaces that value people of colour, where we are empowered. I am wary of those organisations that make empty promises of race equality. They seduce me briefly until I realise it's a trick to squeeze out as much emotional labour as possible. I carry on giving with the hope of finally getting something back, a step closer to racial justice. Then why is it that the oppressed are always expected to step up against their own oppression, while the most privileged watch them from the top? I am mindful of the amount of free emotional labour that is constantly demanded from people of colour for the benefit of making white people less racist, or rather more comfortable. Sure, I have dreams that fuel my activism regardless of my compensation. All our work at the AntiRacist Educator is done out of goodwill. The difference is that we have autonomy in this project, driven by the exciting possibilities I share with my peers of colour. It's a space where political puppet masters aren't pulling our strings, where we have agency and where we feel empowered. I do not trust those who expect us to create free resources for white people before wiping out our legacy, ticking equality boxes and grabbing inclusion trophies. Challenging racism opens deep wounds of racial trauma for many of us. How much compensation do we get for it when organisations led by white people are credited? How much racially literate therapy is made available and affordable for us to carry on with our work? Unfortunately, in the neoliberal, capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy that we live in, our work will often be undervalued. This week we celebrated the first birthday of the AntiRacist Educator. It's an incredible achievement that would never have happened if it weren't for our collective belief in ourselves. As I carry on creating with my fellow anti-racist activists on this platform, I will never apologise for our work. I will stop feeling guilty for taking the time we need, for not doing more, for not producing more content. Now, as I said, I'm not entirely sure how much influence they have when it comes to policy regarding academia. And the fact of the matter is, they are parroting many a thing that's becoming more and more commonplace in Scotland as well as multiple other Western nations.